much of Moses' story do you know? A lot of people know about the reed, right? The basket. Um, a lot of even non-believers know about the whole let my people go situation. But before reading today's text, assuming that you did, and if you didn't, they're in the description. Did you know that Moses was married and had children? If you didn't, don't feel bad. Zipporah doesn't show up much, if at all, after this. But she is here in this text. And so we're going to linger a moment in what I like to call the story of the very first SisterRev. Zipporah is a wife and a mother. She's also the daughter of a priest. And if you unpack that, we find that Zipporah probably didn't get to choose her marriage if you kind of go back a couple of chapters. Jethro gave Zipporah to Moses after Moses protected Zipporah and all 6 of her sisters from a group of not nice people. It's in chapter 2 if you want to read it, but just know that the marriage is kind of a blink and you'll miss it. It was 8 words, so who knows. Moses and Zipporah then, after getting married, settle where they are in Midian among Zipporah's family. This is after Moses has fled for his life from Egypt. And it's during this interim time that God begins to appear to Moses and lay the groundwork for the return and eventual leaving again from Egypt. We don't know what Zipporah knew throughout this entire process. When Moses returned from the appearance of God in the bush, for example, did he tell Zipporah that? When God imbued Moses with these abilities for miraculous signs, did she witness them? Did she watch Moses practice? Did she try to speak confidence into him, as that was kind of his main issue, right? I also wonder if she ever had the chance to voice her concern or her lament at leaving the only home she'd ever known, at leaving behind her sisters and her dad and whatever community they had all built together. What we know is that she is faithful and she is trusting, and amidst her grief, she packs up the family and sets out on the journey that she believes they are called to take. And then we arrive at the random interlude that is today's text from Exodus. Again, I am finding myself very grateful that the purpose of this series is to look at a text through a very specific lens, because it allows me to skip over the volume of questions that this text produces, because it's a lot. Zipporah's role in this whole brief little chunk is summed up with this. So God, let him, Moses, alone. So God let Moses alone. Why? Because of the actions of our SisterRev Zipporah. So she clearly lived her life, right, as the daughter of a priest, observing the actions and words and rituals that meant so much to people of faith at that time in particular. Zipporah also knew God well enough to recognize that it was God who was, wrestling maybe with Moses in this battle, right? This kind of angel form. It's not really talked about near as much as it is with Jacob, like we've talked in the past. But she recognized God and was able to respond to God in a way that conveyed her faith, conveyed her understanding, and in a way that prompted God to let Moses alone and continue on his journey. These two little verses, quietly tucked away, are easily overlooked. And I'd argue they have been overlooked by most pastors in the pulpit. But for women, this is an important piece of the story, especially when we consider the conjunction with our text from Ephesians. This text in Ephesians is what is called a house code. It's one of several scattered throughout Paul's letters that lay out the relationships, the hierarchy really of relationships in the home. Parent, child, husband, wife, master, slave. Very common, very well known, a familiar structure of the time societally. And so when writing to a group of new believers coming from their own societal context, it is common then for a letter writer to use that familiar context to convey a new message. So, context piece one, then, because these texts are common in the societal culture, the familiar structure and language used in this house code would have been an ideal way to help believers then better understand this new system of faith. These are converted believers. This is all brand new. These were not people walking with Jesus, right? Context piece two are the words love and respect. Those are the two actions listed in this verse. Outward love is meant to reflect or mimic or be expressed in the same way as inward love. In other words, it's a deepening, a broadening of the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Essentially, it boils down to this. If you wouldn't treat yourself in a given way, then don't treat your spouse in that way. Love in a way that is selfless, just as Christ loves us. Now, I don't know about you, but when these texts are most commonly or typically referenced, it's not about how reverently the husband loves his wife. Instead, those who abuse power and spouses focus solely on two phrases, head of and subject to. And they completely disregard the full implication of this little section. And it is a little section. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Love your spouse as you do your own body. Love your spouse as Christ loves you. That is what is here. Not dominance and exertion of power. In fact, if you look closely, there are only two messages directed at the women. Be subject to your husband as you are to the Lord, key, and respect your husband. That's it. The remainder of the verses sandwiched between those two directives are focused entirely to the proper, faithful ways that husbands are meant to love their wives. That's the starting point, and I'm just going to let it kind of sink in for you on what that might mean, that the majority is focused as reminders on how husbands are meant to love their wives. Context 3, then. This section says absolutely nothing about the role of women in ministry. It just doesn't. You can't make it. It doesn't exist. It has been twisted to do that. but it does not outright say anything about it. Now, for the sake of argument, because somebody will argue it, let's just say that it does. This is where it becomes necessary to read the whole letter, not to mention, the whole New Testament. And you could go so far as to go back to the Old Testament. Especially because directives to wives are only in 2 verses. There's nothing in this house code that lends itself to the removal of women from ministry. Why would Paul, who, by the way, is questioned if he's actually the author of this little section, why would Paul, who has been such a clear partner of women in ministry to this point, suddenly change his tune on that? He wouldn't. Just look at the surrounding passages. The wives to whom this author is referring are wives in a given context, in a given society. What has been done to women as a result of these verses is entirely inexcusable and absolutely not intended. So now let's extend that last context a bit beyond the letter to the church of Ephesus. There is evidence throughout the Bible of women in ministry. We've been talking about them the last 18 weeks. We're going to keep talking about them going forward. But all the way back to Zipporah, God clearly calls and works through women. Even in the case of Moses, a SisterRev was crucial to all that Moses experienced in Egypt and on his way back out again. We live in a time, and I cannot believe that I have to say this, but we live in a time when a loud group of people in this country are working to knock women down notch by notch. We live in a time when, though we are far behind other countries, there are many who are willing to choose a convicted felon over a woman to lead this country. We live in a time when women are fighting to retain decision-making ability over their own bodies. We also live in a time when the louder Christian voice is the one choosing that felon, the one silencing women, the one speaking against the possibility of a woman in the highest office in our land. If you are on this ride, you are not part of that voice. So join me. Let's make our Christian voice louder. Let's be that different, bigger, louder branch of Christianity. Because she is called not to be silent in the face of all that is happening. She is called to be God's instrument of love and peace and acceptance and wholeness and grace. She is called. Are you speaking?